welcome to Showcasing Sociology, our annual event in which we like to highlight the research that we do, and it's great to see so many of you here today. And what we'll do today is showcase some of our innovative qualitative methodologies that we've used to analyse and assess the impact of COVID upon our particular area of research specialism. So we've got a number of different papers today, looking at different aspects of our sociological work, our criminological work, and during the papers, or I think probably afterwards, there'll be an opportunity for questions and things like that. And indeed, we will split today's session into two. And I'm delighted to say that we've actually got a couple of students chairing today's session. And what I'll do now is I'll hand over, I do believe, to Selby Tyndall, who will take you through in a little bit more detail what to expect from this afternoon's session. Okay, over to you, Selby.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, John, and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Selby Tyndall, and I'm a final year Media Studies with Film Studies student here in the Department of Sociology, and I'm so excited to be co-chairing this year's Showcasing Sociology. So first, I just needed to remind everyone that the event is being recorded and to please stay muted throughout the event. Like John said, there will be two panels today, and each will be followed by a Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout, please just put them in the chat, and my co-host Danish will be moderating the chat, and he'll run the Q&A after each panel. And if you want to continue the conversation today on Twitter, please tweet about the event using @SurreySociology. And our event hashtag today, COVID Sociology Surrey. Both of those are in the chat if you need to refer to those. So let's start with our first panel. It has 4 presenters, and each speaker will discuss societal consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. So our first speaker is Vicki Harmon. She is a senior lecturer here in the department and the program director for sociology. Vicki's research focuses on family life, social inequalities, and social identities. Today, she will speak about her work on the notion of good parenting before and during the pandemic. This project is in collaboration with Marianne Clark and Claire Southerton at the Vitalities Lab at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Vicki, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Selby. Hello, everyone. Just share my screen with you. Okay, yeah, so in January 2020, I was very lucky to be able to go to Australia and to spend time in Sydney at the Vitalities Lab. And while I was there, we had many interesting discussions about digital parenting and how parents could often be shamed for using mobile phones in public spaces and sometimes would kind of speak back about this on social media. As time went on and the pandemic started, we carried on our discussions about the situation and the idea of good parenting. And we began to feel like something quite different was going on. And for this reason, our paper emerged, which is analysing the slipperiness of social rules surrounding digital parenting visible before and during the pandemic. So we've analysed resonant media cases and written this up into a full article that's now under review. In our paper, we draw on the idea of intensive parenting and intensive mothering in particular, which speaks about particular cultural expectations for mothers that are, as the name suggests, quite intensive, that are economically, emotionally, and energetically demanding. And as such, good parenting can be seen as a never fully achieved moving target. And intensive parenting often makes people feel emotions including shame and guilt as they strive to live up to near impossible expectations of good parenting. And we might pick up these ideas from policymakers, from professionals. If it's about food work, it might be celebrity chefs. It could be magazines that are aspirational for us in terms of how we live our lives. So pre-pandemic, as mentioned, we were aware of different images circulating which were really discouraging parents from using mobile technology in the presence of their children. So the image on the left is from a hospital, and the image on the right is from the school. And in both cases, the messaging really is saying that parents using mobile technology are too distracted, that they're not paying enough attention to their priceless children, and that they should change their own practices because they need to be responsible parents. So, of course, digital technology use was widespread at the time, but it was still positioned as something that needed to be controlled in order to minimise various dangers to the child, dangers of not having an attentive caregiver. And we argued in a couple of blogs that we wrote in the Vitalities Lab that often there was a lack of context being presented around this, not much discussion of what parents are using mobile technology for. Are they seeking support from other parents? Are they, in the case of the school one, answering their work emails before their children come out of school, for example? And then if we turn our attention to the pandemic, we can argue that there's been quite a sharp shift in terms of how we think about technology. And we can say that digital parenting practices have dramatically altered, and previous concerns about screen time and too much time spent on screens now appear to be quite out of place. In relation to homeschooling and the school closures that we have seen, digital technology has been positioned as imperative for connecting children to teachers, classmates, family and friends. Instead, it's seen more of a problem if you haven't got access to that technology, if you can't navigate the correct apps. So such conditions have increased the time spent online for school purposes and also made private home spaces more visible to the school, to other children, potentially other parents. And thus, arguably, this can exacerbate the impetus that parents feel to perform good parenting. And the literature tells us there's often a gendered element to this. Research that I've done in the past around parents preparing lunch boxes for their children tells us that often parents can feel quite judged when artefacts like lunch boxes that are prepared in the domestic sphere go outside of the home to the school environment. So this begs the question of in what ways and to what extent has this been experienced by parents undertaking homeschooling with their children during the pandemic? We do know, of course, that the pandemic has been a very, very difficult time for parents, and that parents and children have faced exacerbated stresses and feelings of isolation and anxiety, and at the time, probably when they're most needed, the usual support of sources of support, including grandparents, different public services, have been less available in a physical sense. Perhaps still available digitally, but this might feel quite different. One thread that we look at in our paper is how parents can kind of speak back about some of the pressures that they're experiencing through memes, posts that are put on Facebook or other social media. So we see one here from Tired and Tested. This is Sophie McCartney, who recently published an MC Hammer song saying, "I can't teach this," which was really a humorous take on the pressures of homeschooling. And the words from her on the screen show, you know, she had this idea at the beginning, it was going to be a precious moment to spend with her children, but in reality, it was really difficult. And, you know, she embodied a different kind of personality than she was expecting, Trunchbull rather than Miss Honey from the children's book Matilda. And she talked about being pulled in different directions, the constant requests for snacks and so on, and just, you know, the difficulty around this. And we also see parents sharing this comedy kind of Ofsted ratings to kind of stand up and say, you know, I know things aren't perfect, Ofsted bloody awful, and similar ones circulating. So I think there's something sociologically very interesting in these kind of humorous takes. We also see screen time being presented as very important in relation to exercise, with many public spaces, playgrounds being closed. Online experiences like PE with Joe are presented as the ideal solution to get the family together and do some exercise. But parents have also spoken back about this online, talking about it just being another kind of pressure they're experiencing, and the way in which the day can already feel quite overwhelming without adding this in too. So drawing some conclusions then, during the pandemic, we saw quite a sharp shift from technology being presented as a problem, which parents should minimise, to a solution that could help them to maximise opportunities for children, social opportunities, educational opportunities and fitness opportunities, as well as providing a way for parents to combine employment, parenting and homeschooling. So the conditions of COVID-19 draw our attention to the fluidity of what counts as good parenting. However, that's not to say that anxiety around good parenting and screen time have completely disappeared. We need to watch this space and find out what happens next. And we can say that overall, there have also been some continuities, the way that parents in general and mothers in particular still seem to be held accountable for their children's well-being, despite the very difficult external circumstances that they're currently facing. And we see clear evidence from the memes and the jokes, the posts online, showing how they've also internalised these demands themselves. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Vicky. And once again, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to them during the Q&A after the panel. So our next panelist is Paul Hodkinson. He researches fathers and fathering, youth cultures, and digital social media spaces, and he teaches in our department. Today, he will speak about his work with Ranjana Das on new fathers' mental health, implications of the pandemic for new fathers, and their joint impact work on both maternal and paternal mental health with the Institute of Health Visiting and the National Childbirth Trust.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Apologies if you hear some background sounds. I've got the perfect storm currently of builders next door, a crying baby next door, and loud children of my own downstairs, but hopefully it will be okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about new fathers and mental health amidst the COVID situation, both in terms of sort of understandings of that, but also a project that involves us sort of trying to sort of feed some Surrey research into some interventions to try and sort of improve the situation for new parents and as part of that for new fathers. And just to say that this is based on work between myself and Ranjana Das. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of start by talking about our what we call our sort of impact project, which is a project with the NCT and the Institute of Health Visiting, and it involves trying to feed Surrey research that we've done on new parents and mental health into the development of resources to support new parents. And that includes some particular stuff that relates to new fathers. So for example, we've been working on trying to sort of help the NCT to develop new web content oriented towards new fathers, and that the Institute for Health Visiting to develop some factographics, which are kind of basically like sort of online infographics relating to new fathers. And also there's going to be an infographic focused specifically on new parents and their experiences amidst COVID and the difficulties that that's created and the kind of support needs that's created. And those resources have been developed in relation to parent and expert forums that we've run with our partners, and also some evidence reviews that we've been producing that we're hoping will feed into sort of web content for the NCT, for example. And this is funded by an ESRC Impact Acceleration grant. So the project is based on mothers and fathers, but I'm going to focus particularly on fathers today. And just so a little bit of background on sort of new fathers and mental health in normal times, if we can sort of use that term. So around 10% of fathers suffer from depression before or after having a baby. That's a figure that's sort of fairly consistently sort of been found in studies. Although if you include anxiety and a number of other sort of related mental health difficulties, the figure is likely significantly higher than that. And we found in our project and our research, as had various others before us, that becoming a new father, perhaps not surprisingly, can involve significant amounts of emotional challenge and what we sort of try to call sort of biographical disruption. So a part of what we try and argue really on the basis of our research is that we perhaps shouldn't really be surprised that a significant number of fathers, like quite a lot of mothers, do end up having sort of mental health challenges of one kind or another, because of the series of sort of quite dramatic changes that take place during that time and the various sort of challenges that might occur along the way. We also argue on the basis of what fathers told us that new fathers often can kind of feel a bit peripheral to the sort of process, the process of sort of pregnancy, birth, and then what happens afterwards. That they sort of tend to be sort of positioned by people and sometimes by themselves as sort of witnesses and supporters, rather perhaps sometimes than parents or participants in their own right who have their own experiences and challenges and things that might need support, for example. And there's also a sort of second set of things in terms of the way that they're positioned, which is a kind of quite strong expectations to provide this sort of rock-like, quite stoic, quite masculine form of support for the mother in that particular situation. And we think that that's always there are kind of issues of sort of masculinity that affect men in different ways, of course, but we think there's a particularly kind of concentrated effect in that regard in relation to that rock-like support during this particular period of time for many fathers. To the extent that kind of requiring support oneself, struggling oneself with various things, kind of almost becomes synonymous with kind of failure. I've failed in the kind of one thing that I'm supposed to be doing as a father, which is to sort of be the strong person who provides support and so on. And as a result of this kind of slightly peripheral position where it's almost like this isn't about me really, this shouldn't be about me, and this kind of requirement for sort of rock-like support, fathers, we found, often find it difficult to see their feelings and their challenges and the struggles that they might have as valid ones, as legitimate ones, as we would say. We use this notion, repertoires of legitimacy, to try and capture that. And so one father says here, I do feel that I'm able to communicate with her, his partner, on most things. But at that point, I felt like it was my job to sort of be the stoic, strong man, rather than the worried partner of someone who's going to give birth. So, and a few others sort of said, well, normally I'm actually not too bad at kind of expressing my feelings and sort of talking to people about them and so on. But at this point, it just felt like it wasn't okay for me to do that, because that's not what my role's meant to be at this particular moment. So where does that leave dads then amidst COVID and the various sort of restrictions that took place last year, and some restrictions that obviously sort of still persist now? So people may know that in many NHS trusts, fathers were excluded from antenatal appointments, from sort of staying for significant periods of time within maternity wards, and in many cases also were excluded from parts of the birth, so that they could attend sometimes, for example, the very last bit of the birth, but not most of the rest of it. We think that in some ways that sort of connects with those findings that we talked about in relation to fathers feeling peripheral and being sort of positioned as these kind of witness supporter people on the margins of things. So here, you see that enhanced further still, that they're not even allowed in to various appointments, and they have to sort of leave straight away. And I think more generally, you could argue that their status as these sort of marginal, sort of liminal participants, if you like, is kind of enshrined really there in sort of NHS trust policy, by sort of saying these people are not essential to the thing, and therefore you know, we're going to sort of say that they can't be involved in different aspects of things. So that status as non-essential, almost institutionalized. Obviously, thereafter, there are a number of other challenges as well. So postnatal support for parents in general has been significantly curtailed and is largely on screen. Many of the things that new parents might take babies to and the events that people might take babies to are no longer taking place. That has a very significant effect on mothers, who are often the primary sort of carer at that particular point, but also, of course, on fathers as well. And of course, the support for fathers is sort of very limited at this time, commensurate with this sort of notion of being, you know, them being the supporter really, rather than somebody that institutions are thinking of supporting in one way or another. And there are also, of course, the broader struggles and pressures of looking after a young baby amidst lockdown and the kind of all of the challenges that might bring. So enhanced isolation, crying, sleepless nights, all of that stuff, but in the sort of pressure cooker situation of lockdown. Pressures potentially also for key workers, people who are key workers who are going out to work amidst COVID and possibly worrying about bringing that back into the house with a young baby. And it's also the case, and Ranjana, I think, is going to talk a little bit about some of this a bit later, that this has brought all sorts of enhanced sort of mental health challenges for mothers. And there is, of course, a connection between mothers' mental health difficulties and fathers' mental health difficulties. Often there's a sort of connection between the two, and one leads to the other and sort of connects to the other. So just to sort of briefly kind of conclude then, we think, on the basis of our findings about sort of peripherality and so on, that kind of greater inclusion of fathers as full and key participants in sort of throughout the process of having a baby, really, and in terms of how they're positioned by various institutions and professionals and others that they might come into contact with, might enable them to be, firstly, more informed and supported in relation to specific mental health challenges that they might have, and more able to sort of deal with them if they arise, but also to see themselves and their experience in a broader sense as legitimate and important. It is about them too, if that makes sense. They're not just this kind of peripheral sort of supporter figure. They are kind of people who are becoming new parents and going through this sort of huge change in their lives. And it might also have the knock-on effect of encouraging them also to play a greater role in pregnancy and birth and potentially sort of early years care too, we think. And so on that basis, we've been sort of developing these sort of father-oriented resources with the IHV. And really what we're sort of doing there really does sort of center upon trying to sort of enhance inclusion of new fathers and support for them too. And you can just see we're sort of very excited. We just saw the other day that the first sort of prototype of one of the resources that you can see there bottom right, and it's obviously a prototype and still in development, but that's the kind of thing that we're trying to work on with the IHV. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. So just one more reminder to add more comments in the chat function and questions, and to use @Surrey Sociology and the event hashtag COVID Sociology Surrey. So our next speaker is John Garland. He is our amazing head of the sociology department, and today he will discuss his work on the relationship between the pandemic and rising levels of police recorded hate crime. Focusing on the targeted victimization of Chinese and Jewish communities, John will assess some of the explanations for these incidents and will assess the long-term implications of this role that the far right has played in peddling conspiracy theories about the virus that have increased suspicion and resentment towards a number of minority groups.
Excellent, thanks, Selby. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can all see my slides and how interesting those first two papers were. Unlike the papers of my esteemed colleagues, my one today isn't actually based on original fieldwork as such, but rather it's sort of my preliminary thoughts really regarding what's been going on regarding hate crime during the period of COVID. And really I've put this together through news reports, some of the journal articles, there's only one or two really that have come out thus far regarding hate crime and COVID, some police stats. I've also looked at some of the reports that have come out and been published by people like the Community Security Trust, Searchlight, Hope Not Hate as well. There's been some interesting opinion polls and also some interesting independent research reports as well. So these are where I've come from for this particular presentation. And also just to mention, there is a little bit of a sort of health warning, if you like. Whilst there's nothing I don't think too upsetting in this particular presentation, it is worth just flagging up. Nevertheless, I will, obviously this is a hate crime presentation, I will be talking about one or two issues that are perhaps a little difficult and using one or two images that one or two of you may find upsetting. Okay, so I thought I'd start off with some police statistics. These are from the Met, so just from the London Metropolitan Police Service area. I don't know how clearly you can see that particular graph, but it's looking at racially or religiously aggravated hate crime in the London Met area. And in particular, I just want to draw your attention, I suppose, to the period from the beginning of sort of April, May 20 onwards. And what we see there, I think, is quite an alarming spike in the number of racially or religiously aggravated hate crimes in that particular period. And for example, if you go back to 2019 and look at the same time period, so April, May, June, that sort of time in 2019, you can see a very different picture. So that's something of concern that was reflected nationally. So it wasn't something that just happened in London. So nationally, racially and religiously aggravated offences or incidents were up 34% for that time period in June 20 compared to June 19. So there's obviously something of concern going on there, something a little bit alarming. What is it about this time period that may have caused those sorts of effects? Well, one thing that was apparent quite early on, and this is mainly culled from a number of news reports in the media about what was going on in January, February, March, April time of last year. And that was hate crimes directed against Chinese people or people of Chinese appearance. And these are quite well documented now. They're occurring, for example, in schools, in the workplace, you know, on public transport, you know, worryingly in places like hospitals, you know, public settings like streets as well. Early on, January, February time, there was something called maskophobia noted in the press, which is basically Chinese people being targeted because they were wearing masks, which of course wasn't commonplace and indeed wasn't mandatory until July for the general population. And the sorts of things that are being spoken about and recorded were things like being avoided, Chinese people being discriminated against or being physically attacked and assaulted, verbally abused, harassed online and offline, of course, as well. And those that were owning restaurants and takeaways reported, you know, having windows smashed and graffiti and things like that. And of course, Donald Trump's comments about COVID-19 being the Chinese virus and things like that didn't help, spread across the Atlantic to here as well. And so it seemed, particularly early on, that Chinese people and those that had Chinese appearance were being scapegoated and targeted and being blamed for, extraordinarily, for the outbreak of COVID-19. Tied in with that, perhaps slightly less well publicised, but still evident, and this is taken from the work of the Community Security Trust mainly, there were some, indeed still are, some conspiracy theories going around about COVID-19 relating to Jewish communities. And I've just listed three of them there, but there's, you know, unfortunately more than this. One of them is that the virus itself was a hoax and it's a Jewish conspiracy tied into some, you know, ancient, very worrying sort of, you know, tropes about Jewish people, that Jewish people are part of a, you know, a secret international conspiracy that controls business. And so the idea is that kind of coronavirus isn't real, it's a hoax, but it drives down little businesses and allows this sort of international Jewish big business conspiracy to swoop in and take advantage of that. The second of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the virus was real, but it's still a Jewish conspiracy, still enacted for the same ends to bolster international Jewish corporations. And then another one that was going around was that Jewish people were the primary spreaders of the virus. Of course, an upsetting thing to think about. Unfortunately, not a new thing, in that you know, certain communities have been perhaps targeted and scapegoated for outbreaks of disease since time immemorial, including Jewish people in the 14th century for the outbreak of the bubonic plague, through more recently to the outbreak and concerns about Ebola virus in 2014 and certain communities being blamed for that. So it's not a new thing, but still, nevertheless, you know, upsetting and worrying and troubling. Now, of course, going on in the background, all sorts of other things. I'm sure you're aware of some of these because they, you know, they have spread through Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms, and that's other conspiracy theories. Some of which we don't need necessarily to worry about, but it depends really how these conspiracies are used and twisted by certain groups. And I'll come on to that in a second. So some of the others that have been out there, COVID-19, a bioweapon released by the Chinese state. You probably heard about the ones that is to do with the harmful effects of 5G. And you would have heard, especially early on, there were dozens of 5G masts that were attacked early on in the outbreak of coronavirus in 2020. It was COVID-19 is part of a UN plan to depopulate the world. And sometimes you will see out there on social media, hashtag of Agenda 21, which relates to a non-binding 1992 UN resolution on sustainability, which has somehow been twisted into a conspiracy theory that there's going to be, well, you know, Agenda 21 is part of the attempt to form some sort of eco-totalitarian global dominant regime. And is part of that. Others have suggested, again, there's this conspiracy theory that COVID-19 is part of a global plan to curb civil liberties. Vaccines are a method by which to control people used by big business and things like that. And you'll see that graphic there just to the left of the text, the one with Bill Gates in there, and the idea that here's some sort of big brother figure that is worshipped and he will be controlling us when we all get vaccinated. So those are sorts of things that have been spreading, those sorts of rumours, which are, of course, worrying and troubling. At the same time, you think back to last summer, last sort of June, July time, there was the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. There was do you remember the statue of Edward Colston was thrown, you know, into the water in Bristol? That provoked some sort of a backlash where a number of groups, including the far right, marched and demonstrated against Black Lives Matter and against the targeting of statues and things like that. And I could just draw your attention very briefly. You can see the one on the left-hand side, and this is culled from Hope Not Hate publication, the All Lives Matter one. And that is really interesting. So that particular group organising to supposedly, you know, defend the statues last July. We are not far right, they say. We are not racist. We are patriots standing up for all people and our country. I just draw your attention to there's two particularly interesting things. Just below the R of All Lives Matter is a Q. And then to the bottom left-hand side is WWG1WGA, where we go one, we go all, which is a QAnon hashtag and sort of slogan. So the Q and that particular QAnon hashtag there. And it's just concerning that it's not, things aren't as they seem with these sort of anti-lockdown demos, or indeed the demonstrations against Black Lives Matter, etc. There's these other conspiracies and other organisations and theories, and, you know, people like QAnon and those conspiracies involved in them as well. And so at the time, of course, we've seen and since anti-lockdown demos, anti-vaccination demonstrations, the deplatforming from Twitter of David Icke, but also the huge popularity of some of the conspiracy theories that he's been peddling. And indeed the Centre for Countering Digital Hate estimate that his conspiracies have been viewed online 30 million times. We've also seen worryingly protests outside hospitals and indeed the targeting of emergency workers as well. And just briefly, I'll draw your attention to, you see on the other graphic there, the light is part of the Lighthouse, which is, if you wanted to, you know, you could find that, locate that online. That is supposedly a truth paper telling the truth about COVID-19, which is really just full of all of these very worrying and troubling conspiracy theories. Well, what's the role of the far right in all of this? Well, you know, the far right is often blamed for hate crimes, but really, I'm drawing on the work of people like Paul Agansky here, doesn't actually enact that many hate crimes, but is influential in creating atmospheres, certainly in which hate crimes can take place. And there is evidence that Searchlight and Hope Not Hate have drawn our attention to about the far right being involved in anti-Black Lives Matter demonstrations, being present at anti-lockdown demos as well, and quite clever at twisting some of these conspiracy theories about big business to make them anti-Semitic and about Jewish big business and things like that. So they've been adept at clever at interweaving their ideas with some of these, what seem on the surface to be, at least to begin with, innocuous conspiracy theories around COVID-19. Now, Searchlight and Hope Not Hate have witnessed sort of groups that we would recognise, familiar to us on these particular demonstrations. So people like SS Werewolf Resistance, which is a neo-Nazi group, a new version of the old British Union of Fascists have been present on the anti-lockdown, anti-vaccination demos. The British Freedom Party, you can see their webpage to the left there. They are worrying in many different ways. One, because Nick Griffin, ex of the BNP, is heavily involved in them. They're also headed up by Jada Franson, ex of Britain First, and the person responsible for that Bill Gates conspiracy theory graphic that I just showed you. And also Patriotic Alternative, those with a long memory will remember Mark Collett, formerly of the BNP, and that's his new organisation. They've all been active on these anti-lockdown, anti-vaccination demos, but also other groups that are less obvious. And you'd have to sort of really look into their ideologies and who's involved and what they're saying in order to see the political angle that they're coming from. So it's just a few, just a handful of them that I've listed there. And so really just to conclude, well, where do we go from here? Well, as I mentioned, the current period has witnessed an alarming rise in police recorded religiously and racially aggravated hate crimes, but not just those. If I had longer time, I'd also talk about worries and concerns around jumps in homophobic hate crime, in disability hate crime as well. And those sorts of things are troubling and worrying as well. But of course, there's been concerns about levels of police recorded hate crime ever since the Brexit referendum vote of 2016. So arguably what we're going through here is continuation of a broader, longer trend. And of course, the economic downturn, caused by lockdown, inevitably, worryingly again, we will probably see further spikes and rises in police recorded hate crime as well. And the role of social media is particularly troubling in propagating some of these ideas and some of these anti-Semitic tropes and ideas around conspiracy theories and COVID-19 as well. And just to conclude, really, it's also concerning though that the far right has shown itself so far anyway to be quite adept at picking up on those conspiracies and then would undoubtedly try and peddle its own ideas further from there. Okay, I'll hand back to Selby. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, John. Just one more reminder, please put your questions and comments in the chat, because after the next speaker, we will do our first Q&A. So our final speaker of the first panel is Rachel Brooks, and she is a professor in the Department of Sociology and is currently working on a new 3-year project on higher education policymaking within Europe, as well as embarking on a new partnership on the impact of COVID-19 on young people's lives as a part of a new 5-year project called Young People Shaping Livelihoods Across 3 Generations. Her presentation today will discuss the impact of the pandemic on international student mobilities, considered as a part of a new book to be published next year called Student Migrants, Contemporary Educational Mobilities.
Thank you very much, Selby. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So as Selby was saying, I'm going to be talking today about a book that I've been writing with my colleague Joanna Waters, who's a human geographer at UCL. We've been writing this book now for about 2 years, but about a year ago, when the COVID pandemic struck, we had to kind of rethink a lot of the work that we had done, because our book deadline is very, very shortly. So we're finishing off this book now. Why are migrants, international students of sociological interest? Well, we're talking about now a really large body of people. And in fact, over the past few decades, we've seen a real explosion in the number of international students. In the late 1970s, the number of tertiary students who were studying outside their home country was about 0.8 million, but that's risen to 4.6 million in 2015. And the latest figures from the OECD suggest that number is around 5.6 million. So we're talking about a really large group of people worldwide. And these students are, as I'm sure many of you are aware, of quite considerable importance to national governments and individual universities across the world. So for example, in the UK, the government just last month published an update to its international education strategy. And a key aim for the UK is to increase the number of international students here to 600,000 in a relatively short period of time. And the current number is around 557,000 students. And this kind of growth in the number of students has been matched to some extent by a similar growth in the academic literature around international students. Despite it being quite a sort of an academic backwater for many years, it's now the case that sociologists, as well as geographers and people from education studies and youth studies as well, are engaging in this kind of field. And what we've tried to do in the book is to identify some of the kind of key concepts that individual scholars are engaging with and bring together this body of literature. Joanna and I have, conducted a number of empirical studies ourselves in this area, but in the book, we're trying to pull scholarship together and explore some of the kind of conceptual things that we think are really important in the field. And as we've been writing the book, and particularly when we've been writing the conclusion, we've been thinking, as I was saying, about the impact of COVID and the pandemic. And I suppose the conclusion that we've come to is that perhaps rather than kind of fundamentally changing things, what COVID has done has helped to crystallise some of the kind of themes that we have been writing about and really bring them to the fore in public debate in ways that we haven't really seen previously. And so what I'm going to do in this short talk is just to go through 5 of those themes and to talk a little bit about how we see them brought into sharp relief through the pandemic. So the first theme or argument we make in the book is that we're seeing international students coming from increasingly diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. So I suppose within the literature, there has been an argument that typically mobile students come from wealthy middle-class backgrounds and it helps perpetuate their social advantage. But in the book, we show that how that might be actually quite a misrepresentation of the characteristics of these students. And that now it's a much wider group that's internationally mobile through, for example, the massification of higher education, the growth of the middle classes in many countries of the world, reduction in the cost of travel, ease of communication while abroad, and also quite aggressive marketing efforts on the part of individual universities. And we argue in the book that this has also been accompanied by a stratification of opportunities. So actually, although we see more people participating from a wider range of backgrounds, typically those from less affluent backgrounds are accessing less prestigious forms of international mobility, perhaps with less strong academic credentials. And we argue that actually this changing socioeconomic profile has actually been brought into kind of public prominence through the pandemic. For example, we've heard about students who don't have the financial resources to go home to their families and are stuck in their location. And also with the drying up of part-time work, we've seen how some international students have been reliant on food banks and have become homeless, and Channel 4 ran a quite powerful report on that a few weeks ago. So we're arguing that this has really gained some public prominence recently. The second thing we talk about in the book is new geographies of mobility. So I suppose traditionally people who have talked about flows from the global south to the global north, from the east to the west. But in the book, we argue that actually, again, this is something that has changed quite profoundly with the rise of China and other nations in East Asia become really important destination countries for students, not just sending nations. And again, actually, we argue that perhaps this is being reinforced through the pandemic. There's been some quite interesting work done, large-scale surveys in China, which have suggested that although Chinese students, have typically been very keen to come to Europe, to the US, to Canada, greater numbers are now much more interested in staying local, and if they're going to move, moving within East Asia. So again, we see this as a kind of reinforcement of patterns that perhaps had been established prior to the pandemic. And then thirdly, another theme that we talk about in the book is how international student mobility is entangled with geopolitical relationships and how these are really important in explaining what's going on. And one of the key ways in which this has been played out is through the legacy of colonialism, that education in the UK and other countries of the global north has typically been valued because of those kind of colonial linkages and the hierarchies established through imperial endeavours. But I suppose there's also a sense that these are shifting. There's the kind of rise of China that I've also talked about. And I think we can see that some of these kind of geopolitical relationships playing out in the experiences of individual international students. And this links to what John was just saying about kind of President Trump's negative comments about Chinese. And that was kind of particularly seen to kind of impact Chinese international students in the US, and also to some extent in the UK. And also the kind of very stringent travel restrictions that states like Australia introduced very early stage in the pandemic had a very significant impact on the huge numbers of international students in Australia. And Chinese citizens in particular were often caught up in these kind of geopolitical strategic positionings. The fourth theme that we talk about in the book is the value of an international education. And I suppose one of the things we try and do in the book is kind of question the kind of argument that's often made that the value of an international education is just about kind of, you know, students as kind of cash cows on the part of institutions and national governments, and capital accumulation on the part of individuals, kind of, you know, accumulating capital for entry into the labour market later on. And we argue that it's kind of perhaps rather more complex than that. And that when we look at kind of the individual level, students may be motivated by a whole range of factors, not all of which are related to the labour market. And we talk about the importance of kind of personal development and the kind of social learning, sense of adventure, all of those kinds of wider aspects too. But I suppose we do see perhaps some of these kinds of, you know, older values being reinscribed through the pandemic. And I suppose this has been brought into sharp relief, particularly in Australia, because of the huge number of redundancies they've had in Australian universities, because of the huge financial impact the loss of income from international students has had in that particular country. But I suppose we also see some kind of change in this area. Studies that have been done about kind of what students value have suggested that they have come, perhaps unsurprisingly, to value things that haven't really been captured in previous empirical work on their motivations. So, for example, public health governance, national government competence, and their own health are all things that have come through surveys with students who are thinking about international student mobility at the moment. And perhaps a sense, more now so than ever, the importance of kind of feeling welcome in a society. But I suppose there are also some kind of enduring kind of similarities as well. And work that I've been doing with international students for the British Council recently has suggested that despite these concerns, it is physical presence that is still highly valued. So we hear a lot of talk about the shift to online learning, but our research would suggest that actually students thinking about their tertiary studies often do still value the kind of embodied cultural capital associated with going to a particular place, picking up the accent there, picking up the mannerisms associated with that particular location. And then finally, the ethics of international student mobility. In the book, we argue quite strongly that much more emphasis needs to be given to the ethics of these practices in terms of national governments, institutional perspectives, and also how we as perhaps higher education students and teachers interact with international students. And again, I think, although this is something that, you know, is only fairly recently being discussed in the literature and amongst higher education practitioners, it's something that has been brought into sharp relief through the pandemic. As John was mentioning, there's been a lot of anti-Chinese racism, and some of that has been directed at international students in particular, in terms of mask wearing and other practices. And as you probably know, in the UK, China is the top sending country that sends students to the UK. And there's been a lot of publicity about the racism those students have said, and I think have experienced. And I think that kind of reinforces what we see in the literature to some extent about this positioning of students as kind of in-between citizens, not full members of the country in which they're studying, but equally very distant from their home nation, which can make it hard to access the kind of support they might expect there. So we end the book by saying that, you know, ethics isn't just a topic for academic debate, but it's an issue for all of us who work in higher education, and perhaps, particularly at the present moment, ethical commitment on our behalf is really important for all students, not least international students. So I'll leave it there and happy to answer any questions that you might have in the Q&A afterwards.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We'll now be moving on to the Q&A. Now, as you can see, there's quite a few questions, and unfortunately, we're running out of time. So what we're going to do first is we're going to focus on one question per speaker, and I would like to request all speakers to keep their answers short, sweet, and concise. Now, so the first question we have, I think, is for Vicky by Dr. Holly Powell. So the question is, were there any concerns about digital-online safety shifting among pre- and post-pandemic parenting?
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I mean, online safety is a really important issue. For our study, we were very much focusing on media cases, so we weren't interviewing parents as such, although I have interviewed parents and grandparents in previous research, and I know that online safety is a concern for them. I know also that many schools, including my son's school, sent out guidance to try and make families feel more secure about using this online technology, say Teams, classrooms, for the first time and so on. So yes, I think it's a really important issue and one that it would be good to know more about as well.
Thank you. Yes, I think I finally managed to unmute, but thank you for that. That would be really interesting to keep an eye on. Thanks.
Brilliant. The next question we have, I believe, for John. Can I ask Helen to please unmute yourself?
People hear me? I can't tell.
Oh, yes, we can.
Great. Sorry, did I have some mic issue? I beg your pardon. Yes, I was, obviously really interested in the presentation and wondering if you wanted to say a bit more about the why, the why of you think hate crimes have increased so dramatically, in the past year, whether I can imagine that there might well be a kind of common correlation between social anxiety and its expression in hate crime, but whether maybe there's something specific about lockdown or something specific about being cooped up, or maybe messages that people are being fed that are leading to the hate crime specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Very good question, and probably yes, all of the above. It's yeah, I mean, I've heard, for example, anecdotally from police officers that the issue to do with lockdown and hostility between neighbours has, sort of boiled up into neighbour disputes that have ended up with, neighbours sort of hurling, racist epithets at each other, etc., settling long-term scores through, that sort of a channel. So that's part of it, I think. It might also be that, people have, of course, have been cooped up, have spent even more time online than perhaps before. And for some people, it's really difficult perhaps to tell the truth from the fiction regarding, some of these conspiracy theories that they see. And it can be especially hard to work out what's real and what's not, and what's truth and what isn't, and things like that. And whether that's helped to, foster worries and concerns that have in the end also have manifested themselves in sort of a racist abuse and things like that. Perhaps people also in troubled times do look for scapegoats, look for people to blame, and I think that's part of it as well. So it's really quite a mixed picture, really, as to why this has happened. I was intrigued, really. I didn't really talk about it in the presentation, but why other forms of hate crime, other than racist and religiously motivated, have also gone up. And that really is something that is a little bit of a puzzle. And it's almost as though in difficult times like this, the other becomes the target, and those that seem to be out groups also become fair game, supposedly, in some people's eyes. But yeah, it is a mixed picture, I think. And I don't think, what happened in and around the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and the counter demonstrations and the far right's involvement in them. So that's a factor as well as to why this, is developed in such a troubling way.
Brilliant. I hope that answers the question. Thank you, John. Now we'll be moving on to the next question by Alice for Paul. Could I please ask you to unmute yourself, Alice?
We'll give it a go. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks, Paul, for your presentation. Really interesting. Intersects quite well with the work I'm doing on my PhD on expectant fathering, so really, really cool. I have seen your blogs on this topic as well, and I just wanted to ask if you could explain a bit more about the methodologies that we used in this project, if there were interviews, how you found these people, and if there were interviews, kind of if you had any responses from your participants about asking them how they felt as an expectant father, because that's something that's kind of coming up a lot in my interviews with expectant fathers.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try and be brief. Yeah, it was an interview-based project, a small-scale kind of qualitative project, and the fathers were recruited via sort of various channels, via social media, via some organisations that support fathers with mental health difficulties that sort of helped us out with sort of recruiting people. Yeah, the interviews were extremely powerful. Quite, a little bit sort of distressing at times, that they really sort of did open up to us a great deal. I think there was some stuff about sort of being an expectant father, and I think some of that stuff about sort of peripherality sort of came from there. So people feeling that, kind of that sort of uncertainty about what their role is, I suppose, and being sort of positioned as this kind of person on the side of the room, invited in, but kind of not the main person, and this, it's not about me, is kind of like almost a way of summing it up, I think, that we found. I should stop now, but yeah, no, but very happy to sort of talk another time.
Great, thanks, Paul.
Brilliant. Now we are running out of time, slightly over time, so I'm going to take one more question, which is for Rachel. However, if your question has remained unanswered, I'd request the speakers to directly answer the question in the chat section, so we don't leave out any questions. Now, could I ask Ranjana to unmute herself and ask her question for Rachel?
Thank you. I think there's another question for Rachel from another one of our guests down the chat, and I can ask Rachel questions anytime, so I'm going to hold on to mine, and perhaps.
Sure, yes. Moslem, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question for Rachel?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering how much the lack of communication from government and by a secondary step, the universities, towards the either public or the Chinese international students have had led to the rise of the hate crime towards the Chinese international students, and also the decrease in satisfaction in terms of being an international student in the UK, where both in terms of the online and the face-to-face teaching, their integration with the host country, and also whether they could have done it back in home way before the pandemic started, or when we wanted to go through the quarantine. So the lack of communication, the going back in and out of the quarantine, as well as the lack of communication from the government, how much do you think that was the factor in either rise of the hate crime or decrease in satisfaction?
Thank you for the question. That's a really good question. There's been some interesting work done by researchers at Manchester University, which looked at kind of Twitter abuse against Chinese international students. And their argument, I think, is that it was primarily at the start of the pandemic, and that actually when it became obvious that this was a problem for the whole world, not just being kind of, located in China, actually kind of racist abuse of them actually declined quite a lot on Twitter. So I think we can say that perhaps it was kind of, lack of understanding, and that this wasn't a kind of a very long-standing phenomenon. However, when we look at the UK higher education sector, and we've written about this in the book, which I didn't have time to talk about, but we also talk about how often Chinese students are kind of positioned as in deficit, that they're not kind of seen as ideal learners because of kind of assumptions about kind of rote learning and things like that. So I suppose I would also say that the kind of abuse that they suffered during the pandemic perhaps was kind of overlaid on a sense of kind of them being othered in everyday occurrences in British universities. So I think perhaps it was also drawing on some of those kind of longer standing discriminatory behaviours as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Now we have reached to the end of the Q&A session. We'll now be having a 3 to 4 minute break, and we'll be preparing for the second panel. But rest assured, we do have another Q&A at the end of the second panel. Thank you.
if everyone is ready, I think we're about to start panel 2. So our second panel will have 3 presenters. This panel has a focus on technology in the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, it'll follow the same format. So the 3 speakers will present and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. So keep the questions coming in chat. And again, use @SurreySociology and the event hashtag #COVIDSociologySurrey on Twitter. So our first speaker is Susanna. She's a research fellow here in the department, and today she will speak about the impacts of the pandemic on international student mobility in relation to Germany, where her findings show that apart from concerns about a disrupted educational experience, prospective and current students were very concerned about the impact of COVID-19 on the German job market and the ability of an international student to secure a good job in their field of study upon graduation.
So in the next 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about a small empirical study that I conducted between March and June 2020 that looked at the impact of the pandemic on postgraduate level student mobility from India to Germany. So over the last 10 years, Germany has become an extremely popular study destination for Indian students. There has been an almost 500% increase in the number of Indians who go to Germany for postgraduate level degrees. And this has resulted in India becoming the second most important source of international postgraduate students for Germany. So the popularity of Germany among Indian students can be attributed to a number of factors. Most importantly, the fact that German universities typically don't charge tuition fees, even for international students. Furthermore, an increasing number of courses are being taught in English, and the German government has very favorable visa policies for international students that makes it quite easy for them to transition from education into the job market. So I'll first tell you a little bit about the methods I used to conduct the study. So in order to understand the perspectives and experiences of Indians currently studying in Germany, I did interviews with Indians at a number of different German universities across the country. But I was also really interested in understanding how the pandemic had impacted the plans and the experiences of prospective students, meaning Indians who were still in India, but who were interested in studying in Germany and maybe actively working on their applications. In order to access this demographic, I turned to social media. My previous research on Indian student mobility to Germany had suggested that Indian students interested in studying in Germany rely heavily on social media platforms like Facebook, WhatsApp, and YouTube to navigate the process of applying to universities, organizing visas, travel, and such. These processes were experienced as very confusing and complicated, and social media platforms were seen as a really important resource. So for example, there are a number of extremely vibrant and active mutual help Facebook and WhatsApp groups. These groups are started by prospective students in India, and they bring together a large number of other prospective students who are previously unknown to each other. And then together in these groups on a day-to-day basis, members help each other navigate the application process, discuss like nitty-gritty of the like problems with the applications, discuss travel regulations, visa processes. So it's really a kind of collaborative work ethic in these groups. In addition, there are a small number of Study in Germany YouTube channels that have been started by Indians who are currently studying in Germany and are intended to help Indians back home who are in the process of applying to German universities. So these YouTubers also make videos about the application process, jobs in Germany, life in Germany, and they are really like celebrities among the community of prospective students in India. So this, for example, is a screenshot of one of the YouTubers who's particularly popular. His name is Bharat Chaudhary, and his channel has over 200,000 subscribers. So as part of my fieldwork, what I did was, with permission, I joined several of these Facebook and WhatsApp groups and observed the day-to-day activity in these groups to understand what prospective students were concerned about, how their plans were being affected by the pandemic. And I also analyzed the content on one of the study abroad YouTube channels to see what kind of questions viewers had and what kind of content the YouTubers were making. So based on this data collection, I found that by and large, there were not many health-related concerns about coming to Germany to study during a pandemic, both among prospective and current students. And this was largely because it was very strongly felt that the German government was doing a good job managing the pandemic, and that the German healthcare system was very strong and robust. More important than health-related concerns were concerns about the educational experience. So a lot of prospective and current students were disappointed about not having a normal international student experience, not being able to interact with classmates and lecturers, but also not being able to discover a new country and student life in the manner in which they had hoped. But by far, the most important concern was the fear of entering an unfavorable job market in Germany upon graduation because of hiring freezes and economic problems that COVID had caused. So here, I should say that my previous research found that the majority of Indians who go to study in Germany, for them, getting a job in Germany in their field of study was a really important goal. 70% of Indians who go to Germany to study are engineering students. And an important reason why they are interested in studying in Germany is because the job market for engineers in India is very problematic. Many of the people that I interviewed and the people that I had conversations with in social media groups told me that unless you were a software engineer, it was really hard to get a job in your field upon graduation in India. So what they had hoped was that they would go to Germany and through study in Germany, have a chance to continue working in their area of specialization and finally get a job in their field in Germany upon graduation. But with the pandemic, it was extremely concerning to many that they might end up graduating with just a degree. And they felt that if they came back to India with just the master's degree, even from a top German university, it would not be enough to get a job in India. So this was a real concern. And furthermore, even in the shorter term, people were very concerned that they would not be able to get internships and placements at companies in their field, which were all seen as really vital for getting a job upon graduation. However, despite these significant fears, the vast majority of prospective students did not appear to be rethinking their plans to study in Germany. And this was for a number of reasons. One was that many felt that they didn't have any other options. So they felt that if they decided not to study in Germany, they would face a very difficult, more difficult than usual job market in India. Some had already resigned from their jobs and felt that they would, in this market, not be able to get another job. Furthermore, there was a feeling that Germany was actually handling the pandemic very well, and the economy would be capable of surviving a recession better than many other countries. Also, because, as I said earlier, most German universities didn't charge tuition fees, there wasn't this feeling of taking a huge risk. Finally, a very big concern was that if they did not come to Germany now, it might be extremely difficult to get admission a year later. Many people were concerned that a lot of other students might be deferring their plans to go abroad to study. And therefore, in about a year, there could be a situation where there was almost a glut of applications and admission would be almost impossible at a later date. So in general, in the social media groups and in the interviews, I didn't really encounter people discussing much about whether they should come to Germany or not, but rather the conversation largely revolved around logistical problems with the application process. And here the social media groups became invaluable to prospective students particularly. So as I mentioned very briefly earlier, even pre-COVID, the application process was experienced as really stressful and complicated, despite the fact that universities and German educational bodies do make a lot of information and support available to prospective students. It was still experienced as quite challenging. And with the pandemic, this was even more so. So for example, the lockdown in India had made it really hard for people to obtain supporting documents needed to submit submit their applications. Visa offices and universities were changing regulations and deadlines on a day-to-day basis. Travel regulations were similarly changing. And in this context, these Facebook and WhatsApp mutual support groups had become a key space where prospective students from across India could come together and help each other figure out immediate logistical hurdles, help each other keep track of the ever-changing rules and regulations, and very importantly, discuss longer-term concerns and fears that many had about embarking on a master's degree in the middle of a pandemic and possible recession. Many people in the groups and in the interviews discussed how just being in a space with other prospective students to whom they would have otherwise not had access without these social media groups had given them a lot of confidence to take the decision to go abroad to study, despite all the chaos and this feeling of risk and concerns about jobs. And in the social media groups, repeatedly, you would see people saying, "Thank you so much. I feel just so much more confidence seeing that so many other people are taking the same decisions." The YouTube channels also played a very important role in helping prospective students kind of navigate all this information they were being bombarded with. So for example, as you can see here, these YouTubers were busy making videos that kind of consolidated information about changes in application deadlines, changes in travel regulations, and they were also making videos to show people what everyday life in Germany looked like under COVID. And again, this was highly watched and seen as a really important resource and an honest source of information among prospective students. So to conclude, there was considerable anxiety among prospective and current students, mainly about the job market. However, most were not rethinking their plans. And recently I read that Germany in fact saw a record number of international students despite the pandemic. And finally, while online student-led grassroots social media groups have always been important, under the conditions of the pandemic, they appear to have been all the more important. So I will stop here and I'll be happy to answer anything in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to move on to Emily Setti, our next speaker. Emily specializes in youth sexual culture and technology, and today she will speak about her current collaborative projects designed to investigate how young people's digital lives have been impacted by lockdown, and in particular, their use of digital media for purposes connected to sex and relationships.
Thanks, Selby. I hope that this is visible. I'm sharing my screen properly, right? Great. Okay, yeah. As Selby just explained, yeah, my research focuses particularly on young people's digital lives, mostly connected to sex and relationships, really in order to understand their perspectives on the risks and harms that they face within that context, and how we can best respond to that in a way that's youth-centered, meaningful, impactful, and so forth. Unlike most of the speakers, but similar to John, I'm not actually going to be presenting any kind of new empirical research here, because my research is in process and planned. But what I'm going to do is just explain a bit about what my plans are and the rationale behind them, given the situation that young people find themselves in lockdown, and how that may have impacted their digital lives, particularly when it comes to sex and relationships, because of course, as we've all seen, the way that we're able to connect and interact with each other has been you know, completely transformed, and arguably particularly for young people, teenage young people and children who are living at home with family, being able to connect with friends, with partners, with anybody really outside of their own immediate family home is all digitally mediated. So we know anecdotally there are headlines kind of every day about the impact of this on young people in terms of risks and harms, right? We know that there are claims that lockdown and this increasing digital mediation of our lives have meant that young people are more at risk of being exploited and groomed online, you know, because they're spending so much time online, and also because some of the connections with safeguarding channels, schools, for example, have been more or less severed for a lot of the last year anyway. There's also claims around what young people are doing themselves. So not just kind of child abuse and the abuse and exploitation of young people, but also in what young people themselves are going out and accessing. So, you know, accessing pornographic and explicit content online, sharing their own kind of content that might be sexual in nature or otherwise dangerous and risky to share. And there has been a kind of panic about that. We know, of course, anybody who is familiar with working in this area will know that none of these claims are particularly new. There have, you know, for many years been concerns around how young people are using the internet, how they're using their digital devices, and, you know, the harms and the risks that they're encountering in those spaces. But lockdown, because, like I say, of the changes in lifestyle that we've seen, have led to a kind of doubling down of some of these claims of risk and harm. Now, what I'm trying to do here is understand how young people feel that lockdown has impacted their digital lives when it comes to sex and relationships. So kind of, you know, stripping out some of the, you know, some of what will be, you know, rightful anecdotal claims and the worries about it, but kind of taking the heat out of some of that and actually directly engaging with young people to hear their firsthand accounts of how are they using digital media at the current time to connect with people and have relationships, okay? Be that people they know or maybe people they don't know, and communicating with strangers online as much as, you know, people they're already in a relationship with. And that those relationships can be platonic, friendship based, but also sexual and intimate in nature as well. Because as I say, risky and harmful practices aren't new to lockdown. You know, the stuff that young people do online that may be, you know, where they are being harmed or where they're perpetrating harm against others, or whether they're kind of navigating risk, those aren't new to lockdown. These concerns have been ongoing, and, you know, there's no reason to expect that that would have disappeared with lockdown, right? But we might see a rechanging of or a changing of the nature of some of that, because the argument, you know, that's been building over the years is that if we're talking about risk and harm online, we can't separate it to risks and harms that young people experience offline. And the two kind of mediate one another and one feeds into the other. And young people who are at risk online tend to be the ones who are at risk offline and so forth. But what's interesting, I suppose, about lockdown as a time is that that connection between the online and the offline has been severed in some respects. So say, for example, young people sharing sexual images online, we know that some of the harmful practices that can go on around that, so non-consensual practices, sharing of images beyond the consent of the person and so forth, that is connected to young people's offline peer groups and their offline worlds. What goes on in the evening when they're all on their phone will play out the next day at school. Now that those connections have been broken up, how is risk and harm unfolding online? Okay, is it occurring differently? Are people engaging in these practices, but maybe doing them in slightly different ways? Okay. Because we know that young people don't just say engage in harmful behaviours for the sake of it. We know that they are seeking social capital in their peer groups. They're developing a kind of sense of self and a connectedness with others through those harmful practices. So how does that happen when pretty much all of those interactions are occurring offline or online, I mean? At the same time, we also know that youth digital sexual culture and their relationship cultures online also involve opportunity, pleasure and reward. We know that young people connecting with strangers online, whilst adults can perceive that to be very problematic and very risky, young people can actually be of the opposite view and can perceive that those interconnections with strangers that they build online or people they don't know otherwise offline can be safer and more meaningful and come with their own set of rewards. And actually, it can be what's going on online with known other people that carries more risk. Okay, so we know that the online world is not all bad from the perceptions or from the perspectives of young people. And we also know that the rewards that they perceive may actually be in kind of opposition to some of the narratives around what the opportunities and rewards online actually are, right? So there's kind of two reasons as to why it's important to investigate this. One, because lockdown is probably going to be having some kind of impact in some way, even though we can't be sure as to how right now. And secondly, because we've known for a very long time that young people's perceptions of risk, harm, opportunity, pleasure and reward are often different to adults' perceptions of what's going on for young people in their online cultures, and therefore the policy and practice with young people can sometimes miss the mark. So lockdown almost, or as we're coming out of lockdown, hopefully, almost represents an ideal opportunity to take a stock check of how have things changed for young people over the last year, and what does policy and practice need to know going forward if they're going to respond meaningfully to this. Because the online harms agenda, which is really the overarching kind of policy context that shapes how young people are using digital media and participating and experiencing the online world, that agenda isn't going anywhere. That policy making continues to rumble on, even though some of the kind of policy initiatives that came out of that had more or less success. But arguably, it is more important than ever now that education and regulation is fully informed by the realities of young people's lives. Like all of us, young people have found themselves in a situation not of their own doing over the last year. And presently, a lot of the policy making and the practice, relationships and sex education, online harms, can be geared up around this idea that digital media is inherently problematic and we need to encourage young people away from it as far as possible, even whilst abstractly giving lip service to this idea that there are opportunities. Even a cursory glance over the detail of the government's relationships and sex education guidance will tell you that the risk-averse negative approach to digital media is still alive and well. If we come out of the pandemic and we're telling young people, hey, you know, digital media is really bad for you, it's addictive, it's disinhibiting, you know, it's really unsafe, don't do all these things online, and we kind of hold up a different standard and a set of messaging online than we do offline, that was never really credible to young people before the pandemic, and it definitely won't be now, that by no choice of their own, and they've been asked really to transfer all of their relationships online, right? We can't go from that to switching and then saying, okay, that's all actually really bad and really risky. Okay, it's going to look a bit contradictory and not particularly helpful. So my research to try to inform some of this going forward, I suppose, I'm presently collaborating with some others at Durham University to survey young people about their experiences of viewing and exchanging personal sexual content online, both consensual and non-consensual. Before the pandemic, some of my work with young people was identifying that some of the practices of sharing sexual content online are being transformed and they're kind of progressing, I suppose, as it were. And young people were talking about, you know, going from sending a sexual message to a sexual image, and that was quite well established, but actually the use of live streaming, video calling, and so forth is was becoming more common, right, way of exchanging this kind of material and appearing yourself in a sexualized way online. We know ourselves, right, as we're doing right now, that video calls and live streams and all of that have really exploded in the way that we're interacting with each other over the last year. So this survey is trying to get to grips with exactly what formats some of that is taking for young people and how they define it. Do they define that as consensual or non-consensual? Do they define it as pleasurable, as harmful, and so forth, and trying to tease some of that out so we can kind of take that stock check. I'm also, and there is the link for it for those, if you know, it's still live, it's for 12 to 16-year-olds, so please do share, because we're always encouraging people to participate in that survey. I'm also about to commence a collaboration with a digital wellbeing organisation called Digital Awareness UK to do a kind of broader project on the way in which lockdown has impacted young people's experiences of intimate, platonic and stranger-based connection and interaction online. what apps are they using, what devices are they using, how are they using that, and again going back to that idea of what they perceive as the risks and rewards. We're going to be undertaking some quite wide-reaching focus groups with young people from a variety of settings, both educational, so in schools, but also through youth groups in order to get access to those who are disengaged from schools. And we're going to be kind of mapping with young people the way the last year has looked for them in terms of their digital lives, to then be able to gear up to a very wide scale survey that we want to do to be able to understand the prevalence of some of this. Finally, then, in terms of particularly online harm, I'm collaborating with those from the Institute for Criminal Policy Research at Birkbeck University to do some co-produced research with young people, exploring their definitions of online transgressions. This is a kind of terminology that is sometimes used around what young people are doing online, and it can be the adults that define what counts as a transgression. Say, you know, for example, what I'm talking about, engaging with strangers online and so forth, is defined as transgressive behavior, as is watching pornography, as is sharing sexual content of yourself. And what we're interested in understanding is, what do young people define as an online transgression, and how do they navigate that, and how do they make sense of that when they either engage in it themselves or they see others engaging in it. Now, later in the year, in July, on July the 7th, all of this research, at whatever stage it will be at the point of July the 7th, I will be talking about at an online harms event that we're hosting at Surrey as part of the Institute Advanced Studies workshop series, which is going to be all about understanding and responding to online harms in youth digital culture. And we're going to be doing that in kind of a broad way, but also looking particularly at what that now looks like in the post-pandemic you know, impact of lockdown type scenario that we all find ourselves in. So do check that out, either as a contributor or just as someone who's attending the workshop, because it will be here that we'll hopefully be able to understand some of what's going on, and some of the research hopefully will be tapping into not just what young people perceive as having occurred over the last year, but also what they see as the future for some of this stuff. How much of these behaviours are due to the pandemic and they were just what happened within that time period, and you know, and young people intend to kind of move away from that, and life in the future will be different. What kind of legacy effects, on the other hand, you know, might we see from this, from the perspective of young people themselves, in terms of what they define as some of the opportunities and rewards, whether or not we would necessarily agree with them. So yeah, thank you, and I'll now stop sharing, pass it back to Selby.
Thank you, Emily. And Ranjana was asking if you could post some of those links in the chat for everyone, please. Well, thanks. So we just have one final speaker, and then we will be moving on to our Q&A. So again, keep the questions coming in the chat. Our final speaker is Ranjana Das. She's the Program Director for Media and Communications, and also the University Theme Champion for Technology and Society. Today, she will share findings from her fieldwork during the spring and lockdown in England, investigating the impacts of COVID-19 related lockdown measures on pregnancy and maternity, and the unevenness of digital routes of support at this time.
Thank you. Hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key messages I see coming out of my recent project on the sort of nuanced and mixed role of technology during the very early phases of the pandemic, during the first lockdown, in relation to perinatal mental health. So I worked with new mothers who had a baby under 16 weeks at the time, or pregnant women who were about to give birth. Okay, so who am I? For those of you who don't know me, I suppose I'm a social scientist who does qualitative research on the uses of technology. My work in the area has recently produced 2 books, a monograph looking at early motherhood in digital societies, and very excitingly, last month, a book with Paul Hodkinson on new fatherhood. And the role of technologies in the process. And you see in little brackets down there at the bottom left of your screen, I'm also a new mum of 2020. My baby was 5 weeks old when the pandemic arrived in the UK, so I was in lockdown myself in the very, very freshly postnatal period. So the broader context of my work is that I have been working on the role of media and communication technologies in perinatal mental health for the last 5 years or so, looking at childbirth and pregnancy the role of technologies in the process. But today the focus is not on the book, but on this very small, in-depth qualitative project. And I'm going to look at some the ways in which it sort of rehearses old things about the role of tech, the possibilities and the promises and the pitfalls, and some newer things in the process. So in this particular project, I spoke to 14 women of whom 11 had babies from 0 to 16 weeks, and 3 were in the 3rd trimester. And all of them were impacted in numerous different ways by pandemic-related lockdown measures. And I was particularly concerned about tech in the process. But more broadly, what does the evidence say then about technology? In the context of mental health, or in the context of parenthood, or anything health related, really. And the too long didn't read version here is that it's not a silver bullet, but I think we know that technology isn't a silver bullet, either this way or that, because there are digital divides, and we know about this. Access to broadband, access to Wi-Fi devices, etc., are a huge issue. And the pandemic and home working made that really interesting, and I'm possibly going to come back to it. But it's not just about digital divides, though. It's also about digital inequalities. Because even if you do have access to the latest technologies, there are other inequalities, social inequalities, structural inequalities that shape what you can get out of technology. And some of these digital inequalities came up in the project, where it wasn't so much about simple black and white divides, but rather about broader inequalities. It's also about literacies, people's skills and competencies and capacities to do things with tech that are creative, and the expectations that we might have of people. For instance, if we are a healthcare provider and we just assume that everybody has the tech and thus everybody can accomplish X or Y. Not quite true, because context matters. The context in which you use the technology. Do you have access to that high-speed broadband that your household has access to? Or is your partner working from home, taking up all the Wi-Fi, downloading large files? Do you have privacy for a remote therapy counseling conversation in lockdown? Or do you have children and partner coming into the room frequently? Context always matters. It's not just about tech. And the local really does matter. So a lot of the people I spoke to, but also the evidence says this, people are more willing to invest in virtual coffees and virtual yoga sessions, etc., if they know they can go back to meeting them around the corner or having a coffee at some point. So the local really does still matter. So then we know this by now. Technosolutionism, any idea that tech is going to swoop in and solve our problems, is usually a bad idea. So 6 takeaways then from the COVID-19 project. So a small, in-depth, highly qualitative project with 14 women. And I like thinking of these as user stories. So the speech bubbles kind of represent people's stories, because as an audience researcher and as a user researcher, I've always kind of gone into living rooms and communities and bedrooms and libraries and schools, really hoping to hear people's stories around tech, because those stories are more than anecdotes and they tell us something. So the first of my 6 takeaways is that tech offered up potentials to these 14 women, absolutely. But guess what? Tech offered up most potentials when there were pre-existing connections and strong and supportive relationships in the first place. And Irfana's story is really interesting. That comes back to that point I made about it's not just about digital divides. Irfana had iPads and tablets of all kinds and a super, super exciting smartphone. But Irfana spent the entire postnatal period sitting by a window, watching people go by because her in-laws had told her not to leave the house in case her child could catch COVID-19 from anybody on the streets. She was profoundly depressed. She wasn't coping. She was very anxious. Nobody knew about it. She didn't know about perinatal mental health services. She didn't know how to contact her health visitor. Her health visitor hadn't been in touch. And systems had their own challenges owing to redeployment, but Irfana had the tech. She was on the right side of the digital divide. But still, the benefits didn't quite reach her, so we mustn't assume then that benefits reach everybody all the time. Second, in people's digital practices in that period, there was a real imperative to work with space and place and the living room in all manner of ways to get that element of in-personness in digital engagement. People altered the layout of their rooms. People started these online versions of offline practices like baby yoga and mum and baby coffee mornings, but people did other things. Somebody hung up their webcam with clips on a line in the living room just so that she could be hands-free and it could feel, the view could be like a lounge view and she could change the baby's nappy or fix herself a cup of tea whilst chatting. people said a 360-degree view was really important. So these really interesting new practices around kind of altering space and place in front of you, that came up really interestingly in the fieldwork, where people kind of needed that degree of in-personness in their digital engagements. Third, the mode matters and the medium matters. All remote support is not the same. Lots of mums said, a phone call isn't enough. I want my face to be seen. That is one of the quotes that has stayed with me the most. A new mum who was really, really struggling my first interview said, I really need my face seen. I need someone to see my face. So frequent contact, local contact, health visitors reaching out by video calls, it matters, and it matters more than sometimes telephone contact. Although I'll put in a note there saying in a former project, I found that in some cases, when people have access only to sort of basic phones and not smartphones, and they have sort of calling cards that don't permit a lot of data, telephones continue to be important there. So mode matters according to context. Again, lessons from media and communications that we know by now, but really worth remembering for healthcare professionals and people offering remote support, that really it's not about one particular tech that fits everybody. And it's not just about whether people have the tech, it's also about data plans. It's also about people's literacies and abilities. And Trisha tells me it's the little things, you know, like health visits for the baby. And many of these stopped at the time because health visitors were taken away from their communities and redeployed. And new mothers with, you know, infected C-section scars or stitches that desperately needed checking out, a breastfeeding baby who wasn't latching on correctly, desperately trying to kind of find some support on a pixelated video. All these things stacked up. And Trisha says, I need support by video, not by phone, because I want them to see me. And she said, I want my face to be seen. So mode matters. Fourth, things are not the same everywhere. There's a very large local and regional variation in frequency and quality of remote professional support. And many felt forgotten. And the pressures were felt on the other side too. Like I said, health visitors were redeployed in many other areas. And somehow the postnatal period was considered support non-essential in numerous ways. And that again led to diverse impacts. Fifth, we need to think about what's not on the screen. Privacy for conversations about mental health. Privacy for accessing therapy. Remember, we are only talking about people who had managed to find support for themselves, and that has already excluded the vast majority of people here now. But if people did find support, and if they did have an appointment, lockdown conditions with partners working from home and children tearing around with school closures meant that the privacy that the person might have got, say, at a GP surgery or at a counselor's office suddenly disappeared. Home Wi-Fi for some of these people were taken up by working spouses downloading really, really heavy files and having important conference calls, and their data share decreased whilst they were trying to kind of demonstrate a baby's breastfeeding latch to a breastfeeding consultant online. So tiny factors about what's not on the screen, always worth asking then for anybody providing remote support. Can you talk now? Is this an okay time to talk? Do you have the space to talk? Because it doesn't mean that everybody has the space, because working from home meant that some people's space actually decreased. And finally, the last point, I suppose, was in the perinatal period where people were trying to find sleeping support, feeding support, and a range of other things. Sometimes remote support had boundaries. Sometimes there wasn't any remote support, which might not have been any particular person's fault. But in many cases where mothers wanted help with feeding or with weaning, although participants at that time had not come to that stage, or people needed their face seen, some of these things couldn't be done online. And one of the things that has stayed with me is is the participants spoke of the importance of the infant weigh-in clinic around the corner. Now, that's not essential. Healthy babies don't need to be weighed every week. But it was a social moment. It was a moment where a health visitor might spot a struggling mum, take her to one side and ask her if she's okay. It's a social moment where one mum might spot another mum, take her to one side and find a story of domestic abuse. So it wasn't just about weighing the baby. It performed other functions. And in the absence of those other functions, when these things were shut down, these things didn't happen in other ways for people. So many people continued to be unheard and unsupported. So again, that is perhaps also worth thinking about. Anna's story here, describing what happens with pixelation in a video. Again, her data plan didn't permit fancy webcam views and things like that. It was a video for when it worked, and then we had to change it to an audio, and then health visitor was able to see him feed and not things like that. She wasn't able to adjust him, just a little tweak, couldn't do that. And I was cack-handed, and it didn't work. And then she talks about the video getting pixelated and the call really not working. And that was her only call in weeks and weeks. So these are the nuances then of technology. Some of these are rehearsing all things we already know. So perhaps not surprising, but again, really drawing our attention to what we know about inequalities, drawing our attention to things about not making assumptions about technology. So then tech isn't a silver bullet here, but perhaps there are ways to make it work. So some of these need institutional action and policy changes too, but sometimes in-person contact remains key at critical perinatal points. One person had an infected cesarean section scar, and there was just no way she could position the camera correctly for that scar, for that infection to be seen. Spontaneously offer contact. Irfana, who's sitting by the window for 7 weeks and completely depressed and anxious, is not going to look for the local Mind Matters service. Don't assume that everybody's going to look up these things. Mode matters. Sometimes video calls are more important than telephone calls, but sometimes people don't have the bandwidth for video calls. So really paying attention to what works for whom. And to work in a multimedia way. Sometimes telephony and text-based systems will work more than videos. So we mustn't assume things. And to always ask about privacy. Working from home has generated very interesting new conditions for privacy. So always ask. At home doesn't always equal private or safe to have a personal conversation. And to remember digital inequalities, and to offer one mode of support to one person, but something else to another person, depending on what they need. And to have a joint up local approach, because the local still does matter. Your own health visitor reaching out to you does matter more than a leaflet you might find on something generic. And to decouple maternal well-being from infant well-being, and coming back to that baby clinic, that baby weighing clinic might not be essential for babies. But if we've taken away a social moment for an abused mum to be seen, or for a depressed mum to be taken to one side, what are we putting in place that's different, that can fill that gap? Because it isn't about weighing babies. And to make enhanced attempts to follow up with vulnerable women, those who are isolated, excluded. Irfana's story, particularly there. Those feeling surrounded by large families, lots of in-laws, but feeling surveilled by them, being told by them, don't go for a walk because you'll infect your child. That degree of mother blame, shame. So to really find out those people who need support the most. Okay, I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranjana, for your presentation. We'll now be moving on to round 2 of the Q&A. We on to the first question, which is for Susanna, and it's by Ranjana. So would you like to unmute yourself and ask away? Okay,
Susanna, I have thought this previously when I've heard about your work, but you know, in media and comms, of course, there's a lot of work around influencers, and that's really growing. But then you seem to mention YouTube, educational influencers, and I'm just wondering if this is a new thing, and if there are particular terms about this, or if this is being studied, or just about anything to do with this, because I found that really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there is actually research happening on study tubers. So that's the term that I've normally heard. There are even outside. So I think I haven't encountered any research about international study tubers. And that's the people that I was discussing in my presentation. But there are actually studies going on about university students who have YouTube channels where they discuss the university experience. Some of them started their channels when they were in school. So they were kind of school YouTubers. And then as they grew up, we followed them in their channels into university. And we see what everyday life is. Some of them have quite niche focuses. So for example, there's one study tuber who was at Cambridge until recently, and his channel was really aimed at helping people from minority and working class backgrounds feel like elite education was something that they could aspire to, and that they would be comfortable in a place like Cambridge. So it's really a very fertile ground for research. I know of at least a few doctoral projects that are going on right now focused on these study tubers. And I will write you an email with more details.
So, okay, Emily, so we know this, but I just wondered whether the sort of the old debates that you mentioned around risks and harms and online harms, etc., that we've seen sort of with every wave of new technology, every wave of new media. Do you see post-pandemic, do you see sort of significantly different new themes arising around tech and young people? And if so, do you have a hunch on what these could be? Or do you think a large part of it is still rehearsing old stuff?
Yeah, good question. I mean, on some levels, yes, I think it is rehearsing old stuff, particularly around, for me, the idea that often the scenarios young people find themselves in and the situations they have to navigate are not of their own making. So, you know, technology is created and controlled by adults. Young people over the decades have become more and more excluded from other forms of public space and have then kind of moved their interactions online. Yeah, it's the young people's behavior that continues to be problematized, right? And I think almost the pandemic kind of shows that, doesn't it? That we kind of forced us all to go online, and then young people are then blamed for, oh, but look, now you're doing harmful things online. So that, I think, is kind of old hat. I think maybe what will come out differently is concerns around mental health. I think young people and children's mental health has become a real kind of driving narrative that's sat underneath a lot of the changes that have gone on over the last year. And I think when we think about legacy and risk, I think it will be spoken about quite a lot in terms of mental health and well-being, and also safeguarding. I was speaking with someone from a kind of third sector organization the other day, and this person was saying, you know, it wasn't the case that before pandemic, young people were queuing up to tell us about online exploitation and harmful behaviors that they've experienced. You know, young people were already reticent about that. And the concern now is that as they come out of lockdown, how is that trust going to be rebuilt? How are those relationships with the people in young people's lives who, you know, should be supporting them and intervening on the most kind of harmful and egregious stuff that's going on? How will that happen now that we've completely kind of created that disconnect between us and young people now? Is what I'm hearing anecdotally. So it will be interesting to see that, how that unfolds, and how young people feel about re-engaging with education and other interventions. I know from speaking with teachers that whilst relationships and sex education and PSHE, you know, personal social health education, has been delivered online like all other kinds of teaching, they've avoided the real, what they call tricky, sensitive and controversial topics, because they're doing this into someone's home. When they're talking about abuse or risk, they might actually be speaking to the people within the context in which that's occurring, or you know, they don't know how that young person's receiving that and whether or not there's kind of vulnerabilities and issues there. So they've basically just been avoiding it. So there has been a while now that we haven't been engaging with this with young people, and we will have to see how that unfolds post-pandemic. Yeah.
Now, we don't have any more questions. However, we do have some comments for Ranjana by Helen and Alice. So Helen says, so many valuable recommendations there, so thank you. And Alice says, a really powerful talk. Now, I'm going to be handing it over to John, who will encapsulate and wrap things up. So over to you, Professor.
Well, I found that absolutely fascinating. I hope you all did too. It's always brilliant to take the time out, I think, and hear about colleagues' work. And what a fascinating range of papers that was. I feel as I've learned a lot. And again, I hope you all have too as well. And I think what today has done is just show the sheer range of the research that we do here in the Department of Sociology. You know, all sorts of different platforms we're looking at, you know, all sorts of different methodologies, all sorts of different theories and ideas and things like that. So I hope you found it very valuable. Please do follow us on Twitter if you're interested, and do check out our blogs as well. And I suppose just it's finally sort of behoven of me to thank those that were involved in organising today's event. So thanks to our course directors, thanks to Vicky, Julia, Francesca, and especially to Ranjana for all the effort that they put into making today such a success. It really is appreciated. A big thank you to our two co-hosts, Danish and Selby. It's an absolutely brilliant job. It's so impressive. So thank you very much as well. And of course, thanks to everybody else for attending, and thanks for your questions too. Some really, really good questions and comments in there that we've found very useful. Do let the debate continue. So if you've got something, a burning question you'd like to ask a member of staff that's presented, please do drop them an email. Let's keep all this going. If you're interested in learning more about our research. So thanks very much, everybody. Do take care, do stay safe and well, and we'll see you all on campus hopefully soon.